Good evening and welcome to today's author talk and book presentation of The Incorruptibles by Dan Slater, as he presents a harrowing tale of early 20th century New York, revealing the true story of an immigrant underworld, a secret Y squad, and the rise of organized crime. We are delighted to have you join us tonight at the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Library, the largest circulating branch of the New York Public Library. My name is Ellie Weitzman, and I'm a librarian at this branch, World Languages Collection, and will be your host this evening. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I would like to thank the Stavros Niarchos Foundation for making this evening's program possible. I would also like to remind everyone that if you don't already have a library card, it is easy to get one by visiting any information desk in our building or by speaking with one of my colleagues outside of this room after the program. I would also like to encourage you to visit the New York Public Library's website and take a look at other upcoming 7 Stories Up programs. We have an excellent lineup this season, including music, local history, and more. We would love to have you join us in this space once and many times again. A short biographical sketch about today's presenter. A graduate of Colgate University, New York Film Academy, and Brooklyn Law School, Dan Slater has written for more than a dozen publications, including the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, GQ, and the New Yorker. The New York Times called his last book, The Wolf Boys, unforgettable, and Chicago Public Library named it the best book of the year. His new book, The Incorruptibles, about the Jewish underworld of the Lower East Side, was published to wide acclaim this past summer. The New York Post called it required reading, and Amazon selected it as best book of July. The New York Times called The Incorruptibles unrivaled and chose it as editor's pick. The Wall Street Journal wrote that it is a deeply researched and fluidly written corrective to the conventional picture of what life was like on those mean streets. Raised in Minnesota, Dan lives in New England with his wife and their 2 sons. So without further ado, I would like to give microphone to Dan Slater. Please, let's welcome with loud applause.
Take this. Thank you for, I don't have to use this, right? Thank you for being here, everybody. My name is Dan. Thanks to Ellie and Mariana and Jackie for setting up this event tonight. For me, the New York Public Library is one of the great institutions of the world. I was thinking about, on the way down here today, when the first time I started to come to the library as a researcher, and it took me back many, many years to when I was a law student. And I used to come to the library to research law review articles and the like, and then later as a reporter, I used to come here to research articles, and then as an author. And for this book, The Incorruptibles, the library's archive was central to my research. I need to grab this. Speaking of source material, I'm going to be showing a bunch of photographs tonight, and I want to say a word about, we're going to see about 50 or 60 photos tonight as I speak about the book and the world of the book. I want to say a word about where these photos came from, because I did not get them in a library, not even the NYPL. Didn't get them off the web. They have never been published before now, and those that had been published would have been seen in a newspaper or magazine more than a century ago. Back in 1904, there was a stock photography agency that opened up in New York called Brown Brothers. It was the first stock photo agency in the country, and they did pretty much what stock photography agencies do now. They had a team of photographers who went around the city shooting anything of interest. They shot celebrities, athletes, buildings. They shot, street life on the Lower East Side. They shot popular amusements like the movies. The Lower East Side had more movie theaters per capita than anywhere in the country. They shot other amusements like the 6-day bicycle race at Madison Square Garden. Not the new MSG, but the old MSG on 23rd Street. The Lower East Side immigrants loved the 6-day races because they would have teams from all over the world come. They shot vice, like saloons. Here's a drug addict on the side of he's maybe in like a tenement there or something. Decades later, when Brown Brothers shut down, I think in the 1940s or 50s, all the tens of thousands of images that they'd amassed went into a warehouse, I believe in Pennsylvania. And that collection got passed down to the descendants and the descendants of the descendants. And it was sort of a known entity among archivists. People were wondering what's going to happen with the Brown Brothers archive. Well, it turns out about 4 or 5 years ago, the owner of the archive sold it to an auction house in New Jersey. The auction house purchased the whole archive with the plan of selling the archive off photo by photo on eBay. So this happened around 2020. At the time this happened, I'd been working on my book for probably a couple years. And the book, which I'll get to in a moment, is about the underworld of the Lower East Side and the efforts by some wealthy uptowners to eradicate it. And as I was working on the book, I drew from materials that historians tend to draw on, archives, oral histories, memoirs, newspaper coverage. And every once in a while I would go online and I would search for more sort of tactile stuff, photos, pamphlets of the Lower East Side, of the underworld. And what I found is that the stuff out there was pretty limited. I didn't find much. But then one day I'm on eBay right as these auctions begin, and it was mind-blowing because at that point I'd been researching what I thought was a fairly obscure story with fairly obscure figures. People like the Yiddish horse poisoners, for instance. I had read trial transcripts of these folks and the stories around them, but it was hard to imagine even then. It was hard to imagine what did they look like? What did this place look like and feel like? So as I finished the book, I acquired several hundred images from the Brown Brothers archive, and about 70 of them or so made their way into the final book. Tonight we're going to be seeing some photos that are in the book as well as many that are not in the book. Does anyone know what we're looking at here? Before we get into the story, I want to set the scene of what was happening in New York at the time of the story, because there were several important movements happening that are important to it. We can begin right here at home with the New York Public Library, the great institution. Here it is the year that it opened in 1911. There's the Rose Main Reading Room, the year the library opened. The NYPL was part of a beautification movement of the city. There were several amazing buildings that went up then that we take for granted today, like Chelsea Piers and Carnegie Hall, Penn Station, Grand Central Station. There's the tracks. And you can see the growth of it all around. For instance, if we go to Times Square, this is the future site of the New York Times building in 1899. And in just a handful of years, that thing goes up, which is really amazing to think about. Here is the Times Square area in 1902, still pretty dark. And less than a decade later, it looks like that. Here, for instance, so there was a string of blocks on Broadway north of Times Square, like roughly 49th to 59th Street, which was the the horse area for most of the 19th century. It was if you wanted to buy or sell a horse, if you wanted to buy the stuff you need to have a horse, the carriages and all that, you would go up to this area. And in the first decade of the 20th century, all that starts to switch over to auto showrooms. So this is 51st Street and Broadway, and there's the new Benz showroom that was very exciting to New Yorkers at the time. Here's the New York Cotton Exchange, a stock exchange downtown. New York was the center of business and finance. And, Wall Street, the stock exchanges, they were not new to the period. But what was new was the consolidation of American business at the time. The plutocrats of the Gilded Age wanted to get rid of all the competition in the marketplace because that was having negative effects. The boom-bust cycle was very fast, lots of unemployment, lots of labor strikes. They wanted to fix that. And the solution was to consolidate thousands of entities into these big vertical behemoths known as the trusts. So that was another big movement that was happening at the time. And what ends up happening by about 1908, 1910 is that half of the biggest businesses in America are now headquartered in Lower Manhattan. This is a shot of Lower Manhattan in 1912 looking down toward the Lower East Side. You can see the Woolworth building in the far distance, all lit up. I don't know exactly where this shot was taken. My wife is in the audience tonight. She went to Cooper Union. She thinks it's maybe somewhere around there. It's interesting to think about. So there was all of this growth happening in the city. But beneath it all the grandeur, there was also a lot of rot. If New York had the finest buildings and the biggest mansions, it also had the worst slums. Ever since the 1880s, Eastern European Jewish immigrants, many of them fleeing massacres in Russia, were flooding into the Lower East Side. And by about 1907, the Lower East Side was the most crowded urban area in the world, with as many as 1,500 people living on a single square block. So it had surpassed Bombay, India for that title, Bombay being the modern-day Mumbai. Going to the Lower East Side, here's Orchard Street early on in like 1902. Here's Orchard Street in 1911. The kids are going around shoeless, and they're going around pantsless. The boys smoked, they drank, and they gambled openly on the stoop and the sidewalk. Life was rough. To find relief from the heat of the tenements, families slept outside on the stoops. You can see the Yiddish newspaper hanging in the glass window in the back there. I think I have a laser pointer on this. Let's see if this... Oh, there's the paper. And they slept on the fire escapes. With the development of the ghetto comes the development of the most vast and complex underworld on the planet. I don't say that lightly. I say that after having spent 7 years researching this. It was the most complex underworld on the planet, I believe. There was a lot of crime. There was theft, there was prostitution, there was gambling, there was drugs. Here's an opium den. There's another opium den. There was murder for hire. Here's the body of a garment manufacturer, a manufacturer of men's shirts, who refused to bow to the demands of the Hebrew labor unions and paid the ultimate price. Boys were hauled off in paddy wagons. They were arrested for being pickpockets. I'll explain this in a minute. There were also a lot of gangs, and the gangs didn't just fight each other. They were in the extortion business. There was a gang of Yiddish horse poisoners, is what they called themselves. Actually, they called themselves the Yiddish Black Hand. They named themselves after the Italian mobsters. The Italians had very brutal methods. They would take their neighbor's son and hold him for ransom and things like that, and they were kind of, ruthless and brutal. And the Yiddish horse poisoners wanted that mantle as well. So what they would do is they would go to small businesses in the neighborhood, businesses that relied on horses to get their product around. The more perishable the product you were selling, the more you needed your horses to get it to the customer fast. So if you're selling vegetables, fruit, if you're selling ice cream, you need your horses. And you're susceptible to threats to those horses. So the Yiddish horse poisoners would go around threatening their neighbors, the business owners, pay up or you're going to show up to work one day and the horses in your stable will all be dead. So here is a photograph of a letter that they would send. It says, I believe it says, Mr. Zausner, we are now ready to do business with you. We demand from you the sum of $300. And then it says where he's supposed to bring the money. We are watching you all the time, so beware. If you fail to do as we ask you, we will poison your horses. Sincerely, the Yiddish Camorra, with the black hand there drawn in the corner. It's another comment. I don't know how that horse died, if it was poisoned or whatever, but this was something you'd see all the time on the streets. Prior to, I think that it seems like the automobile started to go mainstream really around 1911 or 12. And as it goes mainstream, of course it phases out the horses. But around the time this picture was taken in 1910, there were probably about 70,000 workhorses in the city. And they were dying all the time from all kinds of things. So you'd see this was the horse removal van, and you would see that all the time. Explain this in a second. In the Jewish underworld of the Lower East Side, it wasn't just the amount of vice that impressed, but the extensive organization of it. Each category of vice had a corresponding association. So, for instance, the Jewish pimps banded together into something that they called the Independent Benevolent Association. These guys gathered at a cafe at 92 2nd Avenue. And when I say they banded together, they actually filed incorporation papers in Albany that had bylaws in the corporate constitution spelling out things like unemployment rights and burial rights, because if you were a Jewish pimp, you couldn't be buried in a Jewish cemetery. This here would have been right across the street from where the pimps hung out. This is 111 2nd Avenue, and that was where the Sam Paul Association gathered. That was the fraternity of Jewish gamblers. Not surprisingly, as the Lower East Side got bigger and bigger and its reputation for vice started to, come up with it, there was a very strong backlash from mainstream America, who saw these new arrivals as a threat to the country, as a threat to America for Americans. The anti-immigration movement wanted to pass a law that would shut down the border. They wanted eugenics to play a role in deciding who could have a kid. And if you were part of this nativist crowd, then the idea of Jewish crime was wonderful validation for the policies that you wanted to see enacted. This was not a minority viewpoint by any means. In 1908, the NYPD commissioner, a guy named Theodore Bingham, there he is, he wrote an article in a popular magazine called the North American Review, which I don't think is still around today. It's not something we would have heard of, but at the time, it was a very popular magazine, and ironically, it had been founded by the anti-immigration movement when that movement, when the new iteration of that movement began in the 1890s. Commissioner Bingham's piece was entitled "Foreign Criminals in New York," and in it he blamed the city's crime problem on Russian Hebrews. He said it should be no surprise that a people who are naturally unsuited for physical labor and who lacked language ability should turn to poisoning horses and selling their daughters on the street. He wrote, "They are burglars, firebugs, pickpockets, and highway robbers when they have the courage. But though all crime is their province, pocket picking is the one to which they seem to take most naturally." As you can imagine, this piece really stirred things up. There were about a dozen Yiddish newspapers on the Lower East Side at the time, and they all took different positions on Bingham's article. Some said, this is really anti-Semitic. Others said, well, he's sort of right, we got a lot of crime down here. Others wondered if he really meant what he said. Maybe he had just misspoken. Bingham did later retract the statements. He said he had based his comments on faulty data. But it didn't really matter. The anti-immigrant, anti-Jewish voice to which he gave permission became louder and louder in the following years, 1909, 1910, 1911. Meanwhile, while all this was happening, there was another group of Jewish people who were watching this with horror, and they were the German Jews who lived in mansions uptown. Their ancestors had arrived in America a generation or two before the Eastern Europeans. And back in Germany, they too had come from a long history of oppression, but they'd also come from a more enlightened world in Western Europe. And when they arrived here, they really thrived. We know many of their names today because they adorn or they have adorned important institutions, Lehman, Solomon. These folks founded roughly half the firms on Wall Street. One family owned Macy's department store, another family owned the New York Times, and this is where they congregated at Temple Emmanuel on 43rd Street and 5th Avenue. Are we like on the site of it right now? I don't even know. Really close to where we are right now. The leader of the German Jews was a man named Jacob Schiff. They called him the Jewish J.P. Morgan, among many other things. Some historians refer to him as the first real American philanthropist. Schiff inherited a big investment bank from his father-in-law, and under his direction, it became the second largest investment bank on Wall Street after J.P. Morgan. Here's Schiff's mansion on 5th Avenue. I think it's 79th Street. They all lived up along 5th. And this is kind of this is how their wives and their daughters would have dressed. You know, this was the fashion at the time, these gigantic hats and those big hand warmers. The German Jews had built a lot here in America in a very short period of time, and they had a lot to lose. For one thing, they worried that the co-religionists from the backwaters of Eastern Europe would undermine their own hard-won social respectability. But it wasn't just self-interest. They were also idealists. They believed that an open border was what made America, and they wanted to remain open. They also believed in elevating the downtowners who were less fortunate. They donated huge sums of money and built all kinds of philanthropic organizations, free education, free health care, orphanages. They built the Henry Street settlement, the university settlement on Eldridge Street, the Education Alliance on East Broadway, and they had a lot of bread lines and soup kitchens. Here's a bread line at the Bowery Mission. The bread lines and the soup kitchens were all over. In fact, there were a lot of Lower East Siders who didn't like them because they thought that it created reliance, and it was kind of that we don't want help kind of thing. But it was a controversial subject. The uptowners organized matzah giveaways on Passover. So here's folks waiting for their free matzah. The uptowners also, this was a big deal, they came up with these pasteurized milk. I guess they were like the depots, right, where you could go get free bottles of pasteurized milk for free or for a penny, and that helped to assuage the typhoid problem. And here's the trucks that they were brought in. I show you this just because if you look on the side, it says Nathan, whoops. If you look on, am I going the wrong way? Sorry. If you look on the side of the door, it says Nathan Strauss, pasteurized milk. Nathan Strauss is one of the sons of the Macy's family. He didn't go into the family business. He became a chemist or a scientist. And solving the typhoid issue was one of the things he spent a lot of his life focused on. Notably, all this stuff could have only been supplied by private money. There was not yet any welfare debt in America. There wasn't even an income tax until 1913. And when the income tax started, it was like 1% for a long time. There were no labor laws either. There was no effective regulations of child labor or hours worked. There was no minimum wage. There was very little in the way of safety regulations. East Siders, particularly the Jewish girls and women who made up most of the workforce in the garment industry, they organized into labor unions and protested in the streets. This was a common scene. This is not a Brown Brothers image, by the way. That's an image that if you've been to Jewish museums and things, you may have seen that before. I love this image because it's just an incredible photograph. Here, the girls, the women are in a room. They're being taught how to protest, how to take the Yiddish. I believe she's teaching them how to take the Yiddish oath, something about if I become a traitor to the cause I'm representing, may my arm fall from my shoulder or something like that. Here they are. It's funny because a lot of the girls on the Lower East Side, obviously they worked in the garment industry. They knew how to make their own hats. They knew how to make their own clothes. So when you look at them, sometimes they look like the uptowners a bit because even though they weren't making any money, they knew how to dress well. So the uptowners were trying to fix things. They were trying to fix these things. But the issue of vice and crime downtown was something that had irked them for years. In the first few years of the century, some of the uptowners had been involved in trying to eradicate vice on the Lower East Side, but those attempts often blew back in their face. Now, however, with the police commissioner writing articles and vice being a feature of the headlines all the time, it was getting to the point where it could no longer be ignored. And by the summer of 1912, it got to the point where it really could no longer be ignored. This is Herman Rosenthal. And in July of 1912, he was murdered outside of the Metropole Hotel in Times Square. He was a big Jewish gambler from the Lower East Side. He was an immigrant. He came here when he was 5 with his family. And he'd worked his way up in the business to the point where he owned a casino now on 43rd Street. And he was angry because he was paying all this money to the cops to protect him, and the place was getting raided anyway. So he starts blabbing to people. He's going to the district attorney's office to swear out affidavits, and people are getting annoyed with Herman. And Herman does not last long. Shot outside the Metropole. The building with sort of the cross hatch, I don't even, on the facade, almost like those the lines there. That's the Metropole Hotel, right there. That's the Metropole Hotel. That's where he was shot. This is what that area would have looked like at night at the time. So the folks implicated in the Rosenthal murder were Lower East Side immigrant Jews. One of them pictured here, Louis Rosenberg. He was known as Lefty Louis. And there was one cop who was also implicated in the murder and charged with having ordered it. So the unique circumstances of this case make the story front page news, not just for a week or a month, but for 3 years, nationally and abroad. The Rosenthal affair, as it became known, was the most obsessed over murder case of its time, and it put Jewish crime front and center. 1 week after the murder, the German Jews met and decided that they need to take real action to rid the Lower East Side of this problematic underworld. once and for all. So it's this background against which the story in the Incorruptibles takes place. But what attracted me to this world, to this time, to the place? Because for me, writing projects often do begin with a fascination in a world that is in some way hidden. But the project doesn't really get rolling until a person appears, until a character appears who can represent that world, who can take us into that world in some way. So I want to wrap up tonight by telling the story of how I found that individual and who he was. About 6 or 7 years ago, I was working on a story that was not a historical story. It was a contemporary story about a gang of Jewish rabbis in the Orthodox community. And for decades, this gang of Jewish rabbis had gone around beating up husbands who refused to give their wives a religious divorce, known as a get. Some of you may know that in Orthodox culture, if a woman wants to leave a marriage, she can't just go to a court and ask for the ask for the judgment to be made. She has to do this all within the community, and the husband has to give her this biblically mandated bill of divorce known as a get. Unsurprisingly, maybe, for those of you who are familiar with divorce processes, there's always going to be a portion of men who refuse the get for whatever reasons, because they're angry or embittered or because they want to extort money from the wife's family. And so this gang of rabbis had anointed themselves the judge and the jury on this issue, and when they got together and decided that there was a husband out there who had refused the get unjustly, they would go find him and have a talk, and if that didn't work, then they'd pull him into the back of a van and break a couple of ribs. They were known to take a cattle prod to people's testicles and do all kinds of crazy things. And this was the story that I was working on for a while. What eventually happens with that story is, after working with impunity for decades, the FBI gets wind of this, and a female agent poses as a woman in need of this service, and she spends 18 months kind of worming her way into the middle of the community until she gets before these rabbis. And as I researched that story, which became a magazine piece, I was reading up on the history of Jewish crime and violence. And in that reading, I returned often to New York in the early 1900s. And in the background of the books I was reading, there was this kind of shadowy figure who often appeared in a footnote or something. Some of the historians I read referred to him as a writer or an investigator. He was a very young man who had written thousands of pages about the Jewish underworld. But it was a third. There was one historian who called him a private detective. There was another who called him a student of the underworld. But it was a third characterization of him as a knowledgeable vigilante that really got my attention. He'd been enlisted in some kind of war on crime, and I wondered, enlisted by whom and to what end? Well, here he is. His name is Abe Schoenfeld, and although he might look a bit older in that picture, he's actually 21 years old, and that picture is taken in 1913. The questions about who he was and what he did sent me on a years-long research path that took me to public and private archives across the country and also abroad. And what I found out was that in the wake of the Rosenthal murder, the German Jews met, and they decided that they wanted to approach him and see if he could help. Abe, even before then, had a very interesting history. He was raised on the Lower East Side. He was raised on this block of Clinton Street. He was born in 1891. This is a picture of that block in 1901, just as the Williamsburg Bridge is being built right around the corner. So he was not an uptowner. He was a local. He was the son of two Hungarian Jewish immigrants, and he was raised in the ghetto. He was raised amongst the underworld. A lot of friends he had as a kid were lured into it in one way or another. And as the son of a reformer, he was from a different kind of household. He was from that kind of rare household who had the means and the contacts to improve things. As a teen, Abe had worked as a reformer, providing research about the underworld to the uptowners, because for years, 1905, 06, 07, 08, that was a business. If you were a youngster, actually, a lot of the daughters and sons of the wealthy uptowners would do this as well if they wanted to like get experience in the world instead of going to Africa or something like that, whatever people do today. They would go to the Lower East Side and they would become a researcher, and they'd go into brothels and they would interview prostitutes about their lives, and they'd write this up, and then they were like freelancers, and that's kind of what he did for several years. He dropped out of high school after his freshman year at Stuyvesant. It's funny, actually, he didn't leave school because he was a bad student. He dropped out of Stuyvesant because he was one of the best students in the school, and because of all the immigration, there was all this overcrowding in the schools. So the principals got together in 1906, and they decided, okay, we're just going to call our best students in and suggest that they leave because the pace of learning is going to slow down so much. So Abe got called in. The principal of Stuyvesant suggested that if he had an idea for something he wanted to do as a career, this would be a good time to go and pursue that. His dad was a reformer who was starting to focus more on vice, and so Abe followed his father into that. After a few years of doing this, he becomes very jaded because he's providing this information to uptowners, and meanwhile, nothing's happening. It's being used as PR, it grabs a headline, it gets somebody new elected, but nothing really improves in the neighborhood. So by the time 1912 rolls around, he's 21, and the German Jews contact him. He's like, "Oh, what do they want now? This is going to be another sort of fool's errand." But they had a different idea in mind. They wanted this to be secretive. They didn't want any publicity at all, and they wanted him to provide information about who was taking money in the police department from the gamblers. And he went out, and in the first couple months of this mission, he had some early success. And the mayor of the city saw this success, and he said, why don't we install this kid in the NYPD? We will give him a squad of 20 cops of his choosing, and he can go around the neighborhood shutting down basically whatever he wants. So this is how the Incorruptibles kind of begins. They go through the underworld in 1913, kind of through phase after phase of it. They went after the pimps and the brothel owners. They arrested the drug dealers. They shut down the pharmacies that continued to sell narcotics in violation of the new laws. There were new anti-vice laws that were just starting to come into being, the laws we take for granted today, the narcotics laws, regulation of prostitution, and so forth. So they were able to use these new laws to their benefit. And they arrested the pickpockets, fences, and the cops who allowed all these folks to work in the first place. And eventually they went after the gangs as well. As I researched and wrote the book, many other figures would enter the fray and become part of the story. For instance, there was a young prostitute named Antonia, and she was a very important figure in Abe's life, first as a paramour, and then as a partner in the crime fighting. I do not have a photograph of Antonia, but she might have looked a little something like that, or she might have looked a little something like that, or she might have looked a little something like that, taking on a couple attackers. I like to think she was maybe a mix of all of them. There's another important figure in the book who is known to history. His name's Arnold Rothstein. Arnold Rothstein is known to history. Can I just get a show of hands? Who's heard of Arnold Rothstein? Like 30% of people. Okay. So if you do know of Arnold Rothstein, there's a good chance you know of him for having allegedly fixed the 1919 World Series between the Cincinnati Reds and the Chicago White Sox. The other reason that you might have heard of him is, here is a shot of Times Square during the World Series in 1919. This is right before the advent of radio. So when you wanted to watch a sports event, you went outside of some newspaper office, and they kind of broadcast the score there. So these are all these folks watching Game 1 of the 1919 series. The other reason you might know Rothstein is because he is the inspiration for a small but very memorable character in The Great Gatsby named Meyer Wolfsheim. Meyer Wolfsheim is depicted as the gangster who he's sort of associated with, we learn about Gatsby's background by meeting Wolfsheim, and we see that the story that he's told about himself doesn't necessarily align. Later on, F. Scott Fitzgerald would say that The Great Gatsby would have never been written had he not met Arnold Rothstein. So Rothstein was a big inspiration. For my purposes, in my book, we meet Arnold long before the World Series fix. We meet him when he is a youngster as a gambler, and what we start to see him do around 1910 is he starts to figure out how to use these new anti-vice laws to his advantage, such as the narcotics laws. Because when you prohibit something, you create a black market, and he was one of the first people to recognize that and to serve the black market. So this is the narcotics room at the NYPD, and Arnold Rothstein was a very well-known character amongst the drug cops there. Through it all, though, Abe Schoenfeld and his vice squad, they kind of remain the narrative spine of my book. It was Abe's story that got me into the project, and I hope that he gets you all into the book as well. And that is pretty much the extent of what I wanted to talk about tonight, and I would love to talk to you all if you have anything you want to ask. Yeah.
Coming.
So I fully agree with the review that said your book should be required reading.
Oh, thank you so much.
But the thing that I wonder is certainly history has treated organized crime in New York, but as you say, the role of Jewish immigrants has been hidden. Why did it take 100 years and you to bring that out?
That is like such a big conversation, and it's something I think about all the time. Many possible answers. We all live in the shadow of World War II and the Holocaust, and understandably that has eaten up a ton of historical space. To the point where when I came out of childhood, I was wondering, I was like, well, they say we have 3,000 years of history here, but it seems like it's all World War II. I didn't know that my own ancestors had come to America decades before before the war. So I think that's part of it. I also think that this is not history that anyone wants to be associated with. To me, that isn't the case. I believe that to be healthy mentally, you need to embrace your past and the truth of it. But I understand why a lot of people wouldn't want this known. And I've been so grateful doing book events. I really have not gotten any of that. It's just happened a couple times where people have said, after October 7th, this is the last thing we need and stuff like that. But I've been really happy that that has not been the majority response. And I'm sure there's a bunch of other reasons as well, but those are the two that come to mind. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm a little bit familiar with Arnold Rothstein, but mostly through historical fiction.
Yeah.
I think Eight Men Out.
Eight Men Out. I saw that when I was a kid. Yeah.
Yeah, and also Boardwalk Empire. He's a character.
Yeah,
in
he's
that.
sort of a functionary. Plot
Right.
functionary, yeah.
But what I'd like to ask you is it Was that fairly accurate that he was a mentor to like Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano?
Yes, and we see that at the end of the book. The majority of my book takes place prior to World War I, but we do at the end follow Rothstein into the 20s, and he was absolutely the mentor to Lansky and Luciano, to the extent where they used to call him the PhD, which stood for Papa hat Geld, which is Yiddish for Papa has money, but also he just knew everything whenever they had a problem, whenever they needed a connection. So that piece of Boardwalk Empire, I don't remember how much of that they depicted, but if you read Lucky Luciano's memoir / autobiography, which is pretty amazing reading, he talks a lot about that. Yeah. Like, Rothstein taught him how to dress and how to sort of fit into mainstream society to the extent that he ever did that. But oh, right here.
Regarding the dormant archive, I'm surprised that Bettman and one of the other large archives which followed didn't acquire it early on once it became available. Why was it just allowed to sit there when there were competitors who would have liked that sort of collection?
The photo archive.
Yeah.
There were bidders. I think Harvard was trying to get it for a while. They're research institutions, and I don't know the politics of why it was held for so long. But I know amongst like archivists, it was a known entity. People were wondering, when is the Brown Brothers archive going to become available and stuff. Yeah.
My sister found out that my maternal grandfather was part of the head of a group of Jewish criminals who were innovators in the floppers. They had these young girls that would step in front of automobiles and claim injury for the insurance. Have you heard about that? Is this an extension of things in the Lower East Side? He was born there in the 1899.
I'm sure that happened all the time. It's not, I mean, it's a familiar ruse. I've seen that in like movies, I think, where you have a sociopathic father who tells his son to go jump in front of a moving car to get the money or something. But yeah, terrible. I never came across that in my research. No, but if I really wanted, I would go into to answer a question like that, I'd go into the newspaper archives if I was trying to figure it out, because the newspaper archives are amazing. That's a whole other subject, but you can find a lot of newspapers now because of newspapers.com. Yeah.
May I ask you, why is a letter about extortion was written in English and not in Yiddish? Because probably how many Jews actually could read English at that time?
I don't know what the percentage was. I know in a lot of the trial transcripts that I read, and I relied on trial transcripts in a big way for this book. There is an incredible collection of them at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice on 59th Street. There's often a translator for the Jewish cases. So there were lots of witnesses that were going before the court and needed a translator. But I'm sure a lot of people spoke English as well, and that might have just been a situation where they knew the person spoke, or maybe it was the child of an immigrant who didn't speak Yiddish.
Is there a next step in what you're examining in Jewish scoundrels? By any chance, or digging more into this, or is there something new?
I mean, I'm not. I feel like I don't feel drawn to like the Jewish scoundrel beat I did this rabbi story, and then I did this book, and I feel like I got my fill. That said, I mean, I came across so many fascinating historical periods. Like, for instance, the money lending era, the way that starts in the late 11th century. I mean, that's a very little known thing. But if you want to talk about, Jews and crime and Jews and vice, that's really when it begins with the money lending law, because the monks say we need a law to bind the Christians together. because everyone else has the Jews, the Muslims, they all have their laws. We need a law. They come up with the money lending ban, knowing that people still needed credit. And the answer was, okay, well, we'll ban it anyway, and the Jews will handle the black market. And that's how money lending begins. But that's the first time where you see, or I'm sure it's not the first time, but that was an important time in history where you see an anti-vice law used to marginalize a group. And then, of course, we know that we're very familiar with that today. Yeah.
Did you encounter similar dynamics at all with other immigrant groups in New York? The Irish, the Italians, the Chinese, and if there were efforts made that were similar to the story you told?
I don't think that organization to this extent was a feature of other immigrant vice and crime underworlds. I might be wrong. Maybe the Irish did have, maybe the Irish pimps were incorporated in Albany. But I'm pretty sure that this was beyond what had ever been seen before. And it's really not, we talk about the Italian mafia today, and I grew up thinking the Italian mafia was everything, that it had only ever been the Italian mafia. But what I learned writing this book is that really only happens after Arnold Rothstein dies in 1928. That's when Lucky Luciano and all of them kind of start to make the thing that we know today. Yeah. And it's modeled a lot on what they learned from Rothstein. Did you?
Number one, thank you.
Yeah.
For the book. I was trying to finish it, but I didn't get to finish it before now. But I do appreciate, I want to say this. Whenever somebody does a movie, in your case, write a book, you're acknowledging those who have perished, those who have been hurt. You're acknowledging, you're bringing them into, in other words, instead of them being forgotten, they've been memorized, memorial kind of thing. So I want to say thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, and I did, one of the crazy things about this book, which I don't want any spoilers, but I did come across my own ancestors in the writing of this book. Not just in a tangential kind of way, but they actually make a cameo in the story itself, which was like the most bizarre thing that's ever happened to me in writing. Yeah.
I can imagine myself like trying to explain to like someone who didn't come to this, it's like, oh, what is this about? It's like, oh, it's about the Jewish underworld. And I can imagine someone saying it's like, why, like what benefit is there to like learning about something like this? Kind of going back to the earliest question, can you elaborate a little bit more on like what we risk losing by not learning about this type of history?
Again, I go back to the personal. I go back to mental health on a personal level. Which is something I've been thinking a lot about in the last few years. They say that recovery from mental illness takes place in 2 phases. In phase 1, you accept the truth of your past and accept that you were a victim. And in step 2, you take responsibility for being a victim no longer. And there's just something about that process that really resonates with me when we talk about history as well. If you're going around with a Jewish identity and that's important to you, how could you not want to know? At least that's I understand if people don't want to read about the seamier aspects of their history, but to me, A, it's fascinating, and B, like, I have to know, to make informed decisions about who I am today and how far we've come and all of that. Yeah. Thank you for the question. That's a really great question. Thank you. Yeah.
My daughter learned about the Triangle Factory in school. And she said the way she learned it is because of child labor. But the way I learned it, it was about one particular woman. When she came from Europe, her father said, always observe the Shabbat. And so, however, at the factory, she has to work on Shabbat. So she was told, if you do not come to work, you'll be fired.
Yeah.
So then she was living with her relatives in America. So they say, you're here with us, so go to work.
Yeah.
So on that, it was a Saturday that fire happened. And they heard, the relatives who housed her heard that she went to work, according to them, because they forced her, saying, go to work. And so, but then she came back alive. They said, what happened? She tricked them. She did not go to work because she was listening to her father. And because of that, she was alive.